Oh, woo. Got the power now. Shabbat Shalom. How many of you are excited to be here this evening? Amen. Give Yahweh a praise offering. You know, it's amazing to me because I've been talking to people all over, and it seems like so many, they're getting the pressure turned up and things are happening. But what's exciting about that is that it's actually proof that Yahweh's doing something among the body. Do you realize that whenever you get put into these situations, these trials, and you get tested and the pressure gets increased upon you, that it means that He's actually shaping and molding you to prepare you for something that He has for you to do. So isn't that exciting? That means that all this stuff that you may have been going through, all these things, you know, that from the outside it may seem like, all these problems, but yet actually it's Yahweh's divine intervention in your life, and He's actually preparing you for something that He has for you to do. I don't know about you, but that's exciting to me to actually realize that He plans on using us. He's not finished with you. There's still a work for you to do. And even though you're quite an amazing group of people, guess what? There's still some areas that we get to get worked on. There's still some areas that we can improve. So turn to your neighbor and tell them, you know, you're really an amazing person, but there's still some areas Yahweh's working on in you. So with that said, we understand that Yahweh is doing this. Well, guess what? Y'all listen. You know, I get 30 minutes, but like I said, the last time I was up here, I'll take 30 minutes of attention. So we may be here a couple hours, counting on how well you shout and how well you say amen, you know, and how enthusiastic you are about these teachings. That determines how this time frame works. Hey, yeah, see, there you go. You're getting the hang of it. You're learning quick. Well, this Torah portion that we're actually going to look at this evening, it's dealing with the same thing. It's dealing with Yahweh taking a group of individuals that may seem like they've been written off, like they're no good. They've been wandering around for 40 years. They've been involved in all kinds of rebellion in the camp and complaining and all these different things, and we finally find that they're about to be prepared and made ready to go into the promised land. And so we find that it really becomes a shadow picture for you and I. We've been written off by most of the world. No one wants anything to do with you half the time, do they? The church don't want you. The Jews don't want you half the time. The world definitely doesn't want you. And yet Yahweh plans on taking this group of individuals and actually using you, shaping you, molding you, and making you be the ones that go and take back the land. Isn't that exciting? Well, that's what this portion is dealing with. It's titled Vaetchanan, and it's translated as meaning, and I pleaded. But what you're going to find is that as we begin to break down this portion, there's a lot of stuff that's taking place that you can only see in the Hebrew language. Because if you read this portion in the English, you'll find that you're going to miss a lot of this. But as we begin to take our time this evening and we actually break this down and take it back, you'll find that there's a whole new level of meaning of what's happening here. It's taken from Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23 through chapter 7, verse 11. And if you've read the book of Deuteronomy, it seems like there's a lot of repetition, doesn't it? It seems like we've already read this, we've already been here, we know about these things, and yet Yahweh's taking the time to repeat it. We understand that it's Moses' farewell speech to Israel. In fact, in this portion, we're reminded that Moses is not going to go into the promised land. They're going to be led in by Joshua. And we find that Moses is reminding this generation of the history. He's reminding them of where they've been, because it's going to have an effect on where they're going. He's reminding them of all the lessons that they've been learning these 40 years that they've been walking around in the wilderness. And so as we're an outsider looking in, at first glance it may seem like, oh, that's really boring. I've already read this in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But yet we're reminded that Yahweh repeats Himself to gain our attention, to cause us to focus on something. And so we have to ask the question, what is it that He wants us to pay attention to? What is it in this farewell speech that Moses is giving to the children of Israel that is pertinent and so important that you and I need to hear it, that it's been recorded so that we could read these words? Well, if you'll turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23, we're going to take a look at the beginning of this portion. And in fact, we're really not going to get too much farther from the name of this portion and how it begins to reveal exactly what's taking place here. And if you read it from the English, it seems as if Moses is revealing to us a conversation that he's had with Yahweh. a conversation where Moses is pleading, so it seems, to be allowed access into the land. But you're going to see as we begin to break this down into the Hebrew language that there's a whole lot more that's actually taking place here. In fact, it has to do with where you and I are today. Turn to your neighbor and tell him, you hear that? It has to do with you and me. So let's read here in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23. See, I was stalling to give you time to find Deuteronomy and actually be there so you can read along. In Deuteronomy 3:23 it says, "And I besought Yahweh at that time, saying, O Yahweh Elohim, thou hast begun to show thy servant thy greatness and thy mighty hand. For what Elohim is there in heaven or in earth that can do according to thy works and according to thy might? I pray thee, let me go over and see the good land that is beyond Jordan, and the goodly mountain and Lebanon. But Yahweh was wroth with me for your sakes, and would not hear me. And Yahweh said unto me, Let it suffice thee. Speak no more unto me of this matter. Get thee up into the top of Pisgah, and lift up thine eyes westward and northward, and southward and eastward, and behold it with thine eyes, for thou shalt not go over this Jordan." And if we look at this only from a historical perspective, it really has nothing to do with us, does it? It seems like this is a private conversation between Moses and Yahweh, where Moses is almost begging to be let into the promised land. He's led the children of Israel now 40 years in the wilderness. He's been there through it all, and yet we find that he's denied access. And yet we're reminded that this is written for you and I today. In other words, it has a significance. It's important for us. There's something in here that's a lesson for you and I. So we have to begin to break this down to really understand what is the lesson that we're to learn from this. Because just as David alluded to earlier, there's a greater exodus coming. That means these same experiences, this same journey is going to be traveled again by you and I. The same lessons will have to be learned, and the same consequences that the Israelites faced will still be there again. So let's look at this first verse in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew it says, Vaetchanan el Yahweh Baet Hahi Lemor. In the English it's translated this phrase Vaetchanan as and I pleaded, but you'll find there's actually a big difference in what's being said in the Hebrew. There's a grammatical anomaly that's taking place, because how many of you are in the Hebrew class and have been paying attention? Then you should know the word for I. The word for I is ani. But this doesn't say va'ani kanan, it says va'et kanan. And so when we read it in the English, it seems to infer that Moses is the one that's doing the pleading, doesn't it? It seems to infer that Moses is the one that's speaking to Yahweh, asking to be let into the land. Yet when we take it back to the Hebrew, we find that the term that's used here is va'et kanan, not va'ani kanan. So we have to break down this word to understand, well, if it's not Moses that's doing the pleading, exactly what's happening here. We find that the prefix that's attached to this word kanan, and kanan is the word that's translated as beseech, to plead here, and I besought Yahweh. But the prefix that's attached to it is the phrase va'et. Well, the letter vav, or va, means and. So we see this in English, and I pleaded. But the word et is spelled with the aleph tav. So literally the statement that's being made at the very beginning of this portion is va'et, and the et, and the aleph tav kanan, and the aleph tav pleaded. And we know that the aleph tav represents the Messiah, Yeshua. Because in the book of Revelation, he identifies himself and he says, I'm the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. But the Alpha and Omega, that statement that we've been so familiar with, it was actually the Greek rendering of the aleph tav in the Hebrew. And he was identifying himself that all the way through the Torah, every time you see the et, the aleph tav, that's me. It's referring to me. And here we find this et playing a prominent role in this Torah portion because it's the et. It's the Messiah, the aleph tav, that's being instrumental here in this portion. Well, what exactly is he doing? It's referred to as chanan, and we translate it into the English as to beseech, to plead. But in Hebrew, the word chanan, it has a much broader meaning than that. It means to be gracious, to show favor, to pity, to direct favor towards someone, or to show mercy towards someone, but it can also mean to make acceptable. In other words, to take something that wasn't acceptable to begin with, something that had some flaws in it, and to change it and now make it to the point where it's acceptable. So literally, when we see this statement, Vaetchanan, in the Hebrew, it's literally telling us that in the Messiah, showed mercy, had pity, was gracious, or would make them acceptable. And remember, who is gathered hearing this speech? It's all the children of Israel that are about to be brought into the promised land. And so we have to ask the question, what exactly is he going to do to this group of individuals? What are they being made acceptable for? Why is he here pleading, having mercy, or showing favor on their behalf? Well, we have to look a little bit further, this term, Vaetchanan. And we're going to look at the numerical value. Because in Hebrew, every single letter has a corresponding numerical value. And so we can look at the individual letters and we can put in the numbers, and it doesn't lose the meaning. In fact, it enhances what Yahweh is sharing with us. Vaetchanan is spelled with the letter Vav, which equals 6, the letter Aleph, which equals 1, the Tav, which equals 400, the Ket, which equals 8, and then it has 2 noons on the end, which both have a value of 50. So if you add all this up, and I know sometimes math isn't our strong point, so you can use a calculator, it equals 515. Well, 515, the value of this word Vaetchanan, is the same value as the Hebrew word Yerusha. In the concordance, it's Strong's number 3425, and it means possession or inheritance. And so now we can begin to connect these dots, and we find that the et is pleading, speaking on behalf of this group, and it has something to do with their inheritance. It has something to do with their possession. Well, isn't that why they're gathered here? That's why they went through the wilderness. They're going towards their inheritance. They're going to take back the promised land. Well, inheritance is what is passed down from generation to generation. And we know in the Torah and throughout the scriptures, the inheritance of Israel, it was represented by the land, wasn't it? The promised land. That's what he promised to Abraham. Everywhere the sole of your foot touches, that's your inheritance. Well, we find that the possession of the land, as we look throughout the prophets and in the Torah, we find that it's always connected to their covenant relationship with Yahweh. Do you realize that whenever Israel misbehaved, whenever they didn't walk in covenant with Yahweh, what happened? They're kicked out of the land. They go into exile. They no longer possess their inheritance. And yet when they did behave, when they walked according to Torah, were in right relationship with Yahweh, they flourished in the land. And so we find that this idea of inheritance, the land, it's directly connected. It's literally this mirror image of what our relationship is looking like with Yahweh. How well we're doing controlling our inheritance was revealing how well we're walking in covenant with Yahweh. And we understand that this actually deals with you and I today, doesn't it? Because are we in the land? No, we're not in our inheritance. And in fact, we can read throughout the prophets and we see that the 10 northern tribes were actually scattered. They lost their inheritance. They're exiled. They're scattered to the 4 corners to the point that they even lost their identity. They had no right. They could not prove that that was their inheritance because they had ceased to walk in Torah. They had been rebellious and they didn't make teshuvah. And yet we find here today that a lot of us are beginning to wake up. We're beginning to realize, hey, this covenant has to do with you and I. And now we're beginning to walk again in this covenant relationship with Yahweh. That's why you're here, isn't it? You're keeping Shabbat. You're learning Torah. You're beginning to walk this out again. Well, remember, your covenant relationship is directly connected with your inheritance. So that means if we're beginning to walk out our covenant and we're beginning to walk out this Torah relationship with Him, it means that your inheritance is also waiting and you can now have access to it. So we have to ask yeah, exactly, hallelujah. That should make you shout. How many of you are happy with the inheritance you got right now? Do you think Yahweh might have something better for His people planned? Or is what we got right now the best there is, the best He can do? Well, this is reminding us that whenever we begin to walk in covenant, there's a bigger inheritance waiting. There's something that's there for you. And in the physical, we find that it's represented by the land, but it was a lot more than that. Because the Torah, the Word, is your inheritance. And it provides for you. There's healing. There's peace. You can be prospered. You can walk and be the head and not the tail. This is the inheritance of His people. So we have to ask the question then, could it be that the Messiah, what's taking place in this portion, where from the English it looks like Moses is just begging to get into the land, could it be that the Messiah, is actually, what's going on here is that it's dealing with this generation gaining access to their inheritance? But also not only this physical generation that was listening to these words, but today you and I. That what was taking place here is that the Et was dealing with Yahweh and pleading and showing favor on behalf of the people that would walk in covenant with him so that you might have access to your inheritance. Even though you'd been cut off, even though you'd lost your identity, it would still be there. And it seems to infer that if he's having to change some things and deal with their inheritance, that maybe there's been some problems in the past that have occurred that might put our inheritance in danger. And we're immediately reminded there was an entire generation that lost access to their inheritance. The generation that left out of Egypt, that dies in the wilderness, there was something that took place that caused Yahweh to cut them off, and they weren't able to enter into the promised land. And so we're reminded as well that not only did this generation get cut off, but you and I today, we've been away from our inheritance as well. So it seems that there's been some issues in the past that caused Yahweh to separate us from our inheritance when we failed to walk in covenant. And yet the Et is showing favor. The Et is here, Canaan, showing mercy, making us acceptable so that we might once again gain access. Well, let's look a little bit closer at this word Canaan. What the Et is doing, what the Messiah is doing in this particular Torah portion. The word Canaan in Hebrew, it's spelled with the letter Ket, the nun. Well, the letter Ket in Hebrew, because not only is the Hebrew language, not only is every single letter a sound, like the English, all our letters are sounds, but it also has a numerical value. But it also has a picture. It has a musical note. It has a sound associated with it. And all this is wrapped up in every single letter. Well, the letter Ket is the picture of a fence, a wall, or a border. It's attached to the letters nun, which actually form the word for life or seed. And we know that in the Hebrew mindset, seed and word are synonymous. The words that we speak are seed. The word of Yahweh is seed that's planted into the hearts that becomes our ground. And so as we look at this, we find that the Et, the Messiah, in his mercy, he's actually fencing off and establishing a border. And the reason he's establishing this border and creating this wall that's going to keep certain things in and keep other things out is to preserve the life, to preserve the seed. In other words, he's keeping the inheritance from being compromised, from being made not. And so we find that this is the reason that every time Israel misbehaved, every time they failed to walk in covenant, what happened? They were separated from the inheritance. There was a wall, there was a border to keep the inheritance from being compromised. And here we find that he's reminding this generation as they prepare to enter into the land of this very fact. He reminds them of a generation that was cut off because they weren't willing to walk in Torah, so they didn't gain access to their inheritance. Well, let's look at the phrase "at that time." We're told, it says, "And I besought Yahweh at that time, saying." Well, the phrase "at that time" in Hebrew, it's the word "et," and it means time. It's spelled ayin tav, but it comes from the root adah, and it means to pass on, to advance, to go on, to pass by, or to remove. But it's interesting because in the Hebrew, this word is spelled with the ayin, the dalet, and the hey. These same letters form two other words that help us to fill out this picture of what's taking place here. The ayin, the dalet, and the hey also form the word meaning a congregation, an assembly, literally the entire group, the idah. But it also forms the same letters that form the word meaning filthiness, menstruation, idah. It's a cognate of the term nidah. We've heard that term a lot, and it deals with being impure, unclean, one that can't come into the temple, the tabernacle, because you're ritually unclean. You're nidah. And so as we begin to look at this word "at that time," we find that once again clues are being given to us, and it seems like it has less and less to do with Moses as an individual and more to do with something on a broader scale, doesn't it? Something that's taking place that's going to affect not only all that are hearing this, but also you and I today. And we find that the Et, the Messiah, is pleading on behalf of the Idah, on behalf of the congregation, the assembly that's been gathered. And the reason he's intervening and pleading on their behalf is in order for their filthiness, their unclean Edah state to be removed. In other words, so they can be able to pass on, to advance, to go on. And we find that what's happening here as Vaetchanan, he's literally taking this group of individuals that have been forged in the wilderness, and he's making them acceptable. He's getting them ready to take their inheritance so that they might go into the land. Well, do you realize that's exactly what he's doing with you and I today as well? As we go through these different things, as we go through the trials and the pressure increases, he's making you acceptable. He's making you able to pass on, to go on, so that you might claim your inheritance. And so we find that this is exactly what is taking place in this portion as well. But it causes us to ask the question, if he's pleading on their behalf, if he's intervening, if he's dealing with this generation before they prepare to enter into the promised land, we have to ask why. What might it be that Israel would be involved in that would cause them to open doors that would compromise their inheritance? In other words, what might they do that would cause them to be cut off and not gain access? What did the first generation do? What have we done in the past that have caused us to be cut off? So we have to ask, what exactly is it that he has to plead on our behalf for? Well, our clue is first given in this portion because he directly reminds us, after we see the Vaetchanan, after the Et is pleading on behalf of the people, we're reminded that Moses is not going into the promised land. Well, this becomes a clue to remind us of exactly what our sins have been that have caused us to be cut off from our inheritance. Why is Moses not going? Well, in Numbers chapter 27, verse 13 through verse 14, Yahweh speaks to him and he tells him that when you have seen it, in other words, when you have seen the promised land, he allows Moses to see it. But after you see it, you shall be gathered unto thy people as Aaron thy brother was gathered. For you rebelled against my commandment. And it's interesting that the word commandment there is actually pay. It means mouth. They rebelled against the mouth of Yahweh, his words that were spoken forth. You rebelled against my mouth in the desert of Zin, in the strife of the congregation, to sanctify me at the water before their eyes. That is the water of Meribah in Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin. And if we backtrack, we remember that Moses and Aaron, they strike the rock twice, don't they? And after he strikes the rock the second time, we're told that you're not going to enter into the land. Well, if we only look at this from the English and from our own standpoint, we think, well, he was frustrated, he was aggravated, the people are complaining, they're murmuring, they can be really annoying. And so in his agitation, he strikes the rock twice. But yet when we begin to break it down, you'll find that whatever happened here prevents Moses from entering the land. So let's take a little closer look at this. He says that for you rebelled against my mouth. The term rebelled here is marah, and it means to be contentious, to be rebellious, to be disobedient towards. But it's interesting because this word can also mean to stroke, to stripe, or to lash with a whip. It also has the meaning to pass a razor over the skin. Well, immediately when I saw this word, it means to stroke, to stripe, or to lash with a whip. Who does that remind us of? Who would be the one that would be lashed, the one that would be striped? It points us right back to the one that's pleading on their behalf right here, the Et, the Messiah. In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, we're told that he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities, the chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. And so we find that it's actually revealing who exactly are they rebelling against in this particular verse here. They're rebelling against the very one that would intervene in order so they could keep their inheritance. And we're reminded that as we look at this, the Messiah was the mouth. He was the Word made flesh, the pay of Yahweh in the earth. He would be the one that would be striped, and the reason he was striped was so that all of us that had been cut off and could no longer claim our inheritance, that you might be grafted back in. And yet we find that the very individuals that he pleads on our behalf, the very individuals that he's seeking to allow to gain their inheritance, rebel against him in this particular verse. They rebel at the waters of Meribah. And so instead of aiding in preserving and keeping the inheritance, they bring strife and division. They rebel in the camp. But what else is really interesting here is that as you begin to break down this word Merah, we're reminded that, okay, Yeshua, He's the Word made flesh. He's the mouth of Yahweh in the earth. Literally, he's a walking Torah scroll. That's what he was. He's the Word made flesh. Well, if we look at a physical Torah scroll, what's it written on? It's written on parchment that's taken from the skins of animals. Well, this particular word, mera, it can mean to take a razor and to pass it over the skin. And so we find that the picture that's being presented here in this word rebellion, it's a lot more than just not doing what we're told. But we find that rebellion in the eyes of Yahweh, it's literally as if we've just taken a razor and we've applied it to the Torah. We've just cut up the Torah. We've just striped that parchment. We've just destroyed it, and we've damaged the et. And so we find here, as he's reminding this generation, and they're preparing to go into the land to take their inheritance, he reminds them of the rebellion and the reasons they've been cut off in the past. The generation that died in the wilderness. The reason that Moses won't be going in was because they had attempted to destroy the Torah in their rebellion, in their strife, in their division. Well, do you realize that every single time you and I get involved in these type of things as well, if we become an individual that likes to rebel, that's involved in strife, that's involved in division, it actually is showing us the same idea. It's as if we've just destroyed the Torah by our actions. It's as if we've taken the razor to it and chopped it up. Well, let's look at the word Meribah, where this took place, where they rebelled at. The word Meribah in Hebrew, it's translated as strife or contention. It comes from the rib, Strong's number 7378, and means to strive, to contend, to make a complaint. But it's interesting because it has a numerical value of 257. It's the same value in the Hebrew as the word kartom, which means a diviner, a magician. But specifically, it's a person that is an engraver, a writer of this occult knowledge, a sacred scribe. The same term is used to describe the magicians of Pharaoh. Well, do you realize that one of the commandments was that every king had to write a copy of the Torah? They had to write their own copy. Well, in the book of Revelation, chapter 5, verse 10, we're told that we've been made kings and priests. That means that you and I as well are to write our own copy. And you can physically write the Torah, but you know how we do it? How we actually write our own copy of the Torah? It's by the words that we speak. It's by the actions. It's our lifestyle. That's how we write our Torah. And if we're being made kings and priests, that means that you and I, whatever we're doing, we're writing something. Our lifestyle. It should be the Torah. And yet we find that whenever we're involved in the situations like Meribah, when we're involved in rebellion, when we're involved in strife and contention, when we become complainers, people that contend with one another, it's as if you've become a scribe of another knowledge. It's as if you're a sacred writer, an engraver of something else besides the Torah. And so we find that not only is our strife and division, as the Et begins to plead on behalf of the children of Israel, he reminds them that not only has our strife and division caused the Torah to be destroyed in our midst, but actually we become a scribe, we become an engraver of another knowledge. Our lifestyle depicts another master. We're listening to someone else. And we find this is exactly what the sin of the spies was. When the spies come back, they bring back an evil report. And we find they actually reject their inheritance. They reject the debar, the word, the life, and they cause division and rebellion in the camp. And we're reminded here that because of that, the whole generation is cut off. Because of the strife, because of the division, because of the rebellion, they're not allowed to gain access to the inheritance. Instead, they had chosen to walk in opposition to the covenant. And yet here we find the Et in this Torah portion ensuring that that generation, the generation that's involved in strife, the generation that's involved in division, that there's a wall, there's a fence, that letter ket. There's a division between the two, and the inheritance is not at stake, lest the whole camp be compromised. And so we're reminded as we begin to look into this portion, because remember, you and I are in the same place, aren't we? We're preparing to take back the land. We're being prepared to once again gain access to our inheritance. And we find that we're being reminded that if we act like that generation, if we become involved in Meribah, if we're involved in the strife and the division, if our lifestyle isn't exemplifying the Torah, but instead we're writing something else with the words that we speak and our actions, then we actually become in danger of being the generation that's walled off from our inheritance as well. Now, it's no accident this particular Torah portion, it's the 45th portion of the year. 45 is a significant number, and you really won't see the connection until you begin to dig, and you realize that there's 45 years that pass from when the spies are sent out by Moses until Caleb, one of the spies that brought back a good report, one that was willing to let his life exemplify the Torah, till he gets to claim his inheritance. His inheritance was the possession of the city known as Hebron. In Joshua 14:10 we're told, "And now behold, Yahweh hath kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years, even since Yahweh spake this word unto Moshe, while the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness, and now, lo, I am this day 85 years old." And it goes on and it talks about how he just claims his possession, his inheritance of Hebron. So this portion starts off with the Et pleading on behalf of a generation that they might actually claim their inheritance in spite of the rebellion, in spite of the shortcomings that have been there in the past. And if we fast forward, we find that this actually takes place to the date. Well, we have to understand Hebron. Hebron was the inheritance that is claimed 45 years later. And this is the 45th Torah portion where they're being groomed, prepared, and made ready to take their inheritance. Well, Hebron is a very significant location. How many of you realize that it was originally controlled by the giants? But it's interesting because it's here in this location that Sarah, the wife of Abraham, dies. And as she dies, Abraham purchases a location here. It was called the Cave of Machpelah in order to bury his wife Sarah. And we see this happening in Genesis chapter 23. It's the only piece of property that Abraham actually ever purchases. He's promised the entire promised land. He's promised every place that his foot has touched, but yet he only purchases the Cave of Machpelah. Later we find that Abraham, Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah are all buried at this particular location. And this happens to be the possession that's claimed by Caleb 45 years after the spies are sent into the land. If we look back, we realize that Abraham purchases this cave, this piece of property, this little piece of inheritance for 400 shekels. Well, 400 is a significant number because it's the number that's associated with the letter Tav. The letter Tav represents a seal. It's the mark of the covenant. Literally, it becomes a standard, and it reminds not only the enemies of Israel, but the children of Israel as well, that Yahweh was going to keep his promise, that their inheritance was going to be theirs. And we find that as we look at these events, the Et now pleading on behalf of this generation so they might gain access to their inheritance, it actually becomes a shadow picture of our redemption, how we would be brought back because the Messiah, because the Et Canaan, because he was merciful, gracious, and he actually preserves what he has for you. And we find that he was willing to make us acceptable. He was willing to take the time to change our hearts, to raise up a generation in the wilderness that would take back their inheritance. Well, let's look at this word Hebron. In the Hebrew, it's translated as meaning association, but it comes from the root and it means to unite, to join together, to bind together, to be in league or to have fellowship with. But it's interesting as we break down this word, it actually shows how it comes full circle. A generation is cut off because they're unwilling to let Torah be the words of their mouth. They bring back an evil report. They're individuals that aren't willing to write the Torah with their actions. But yet Hebron, when the inheritance is finally taken, if you break apart this name, it's spelled with a ket and the bait, which means heart. It's another term for heart in Hebrew. And it's attached to the resh, the vav, and the nun. It's the word that means to shout for joy, to sing, the utterance or the crying out of a person. And so we have the heart and shouting for joy, the crying out of a person. And it seems to echo Luke chapter 6, verse 45, where we're told that it's from the heart that the mouth speaks. The abundance of the heart is where it comes from. And so we're reminded when he takes Hebron that he was able to change the hearts of the people. Because the Messiah was willing to Canaan, to be merciful, to plead on our behalf, our hearts could be changed. And we find that instead of being individuals that would destroy life, destroy the Torah, instead of being ones that would allow ourselves to be cut off from our inheritance, being an engraver or a writer of rebellion and strife, the words of our mouth, instead, they become changed. And when we get our inheritance, the words of our mouth are shouts of joy. In Psalm 118, verse 15, we're told that the voice of rejoicing and salvation, Yeshua, is in the tabernacle of the righteous. The right hand of Yahweh doeth valiantly. And so we find this portion, it actually deals more with you and I, doesn't it? Because this generation was about to go into the land, and yet we find the the Messiah, pleading on behalf, looking and seeing that this inheritance would be at stake again in the days that you and I live in. Isn't the land quite a hot topic as usual? And yet we find that the is merciful. He preserves the inheritance of his people, and he reminds you and I that even though we've been cut off, even though we've been away, that if we'll allow him to change our hearts, if we'll allow the words of our mouth to become shouts of joy, that we again can be joined to our inheritance. In fact, in Jeremiah chapter 30, verse 3, he reminds us and prophesies that, "For lo, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel and Judah, saith Yahweh, and I will cause them to return to the land that I gave to their fathers, and they shall possess it." Do you realize that our actions, our words, can keep us from entering into the promised land? Even Moses, the friend of Yahweh, the one that received the tablets of stone, was cut off because of his words. Was cut off because his life, instead of portraying the Torah, he actually began to portray something else. He became involved in rebellion, strife, and division. And yet we find that's exactly the same way the enemy operates today, isn't it? He chooses to cause strife. He tries to drive wedges and walls between the believers. And when he does that, and when we allow it, it actually keeps us from our inheritance. And yet the Messiah, is willing to plead on our behalf. He's willing to take us, and even though we've been involved in these things in the past, and actually make us acceptable, make us vessels that can actually go and take back our inheritance. We hope that you have enjoyed this teaching and that you'll join us again tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Shabbat Shalom.
Hallelujah. Powerful word. I'm sure there may be some questions and comments. We'll do that very quickly. We'll take 2 questions or 2 comments, and then we'll move right along. If not, excuse me. Two questions.
Oh, I don't have one. Not yet.
Anybody else have a question? Anybody have a question or comment? Does anybody? Do you want to come make it? All right. Yes, sir.
Brittney, since nobody had questions for you, it's fair that you turn the tables on them.
Oh, okay. I don't.
And so let's assume that there are people here who have not been in Hebrew roots. They don't understand about their heritage. And you started out tonight talking about a greater exodus and all that sort of thing. Why don't you ask a question about something pretty beginnerish, and we'll ask somebody that's been here less than 6 weeks if they know it. But, yes, ma'am. Nice hairdo, by the way.
You're good at making up questions.
No. Okay. So, and then after that, we'll ask, like the whole crowd, people who've been here a long time, a hard question from tonight's lesson, okay?
What about just explain the greater exodus?
We'll ask somebody first. And then when they don't get it, you'll have to. Oh, who has not been here more than 6 months? Less than 6 months. Come on, be brave. I know you guys back there, Carlos. Okay. So the question is, do you know what the greater exodus is, and can you explain it? Somebody less than 6 months. Okay. We'll let you guys try it.
There.
I'm nervous. I'm Julia, and this is Robert, my husband, and hi. Well, about a year and a half ago, God told us to leave our house when the market was really bad to try to sell it. And we said, well, what do you want us to do? And he said, sell it. And I'm like, okay, well, you better sell it. So we left in our truck in a tent, and we went to see my daughter who was going to have my grandchild in Missouri. And we went from there to see my husband's daughters in Arizona. And on the way, we were in Oklahoma. And we were too tired at this truck stop where we got gas to find a place to put up our tent. And we figured they wouldn't want it in the truck stop. So we put the stuff from the back seat of our truck into the front seat and put down the seats. And he's 6'7", so he had to sleep crunched up. So we had like this much space for the two of us and two little dogs. And
All right.
we were praising God in the middle of the night because we were getting big hailstorms like this when it was trencher rain, horrible. And we're just praising Him because we're in there dry and our tent wasn't tore up and we weren't tore up. So in the morning, our rhino liner had turned into a bowl of water and our suitcases had become wicks. So we put out a tarp and it was really hot and sunny and we were drying everything out, and a few people came by thinking they could buy everything in a yard sale, and we're like, no.
That's when you come to the part where
So the
get rid of it. Yeah.
So the third set of people who came by, they weren't going to stop. They had everything they needed, and their little tiny dog decided it had to stop right there. So as soon as they put it out of the car, it beelined it all the way across the parking lot over to us. And within 2 minutes, they found out that we were Christians and what we were doing, that we went on the road for Him in a tent, and they gave us a fifth wheel. So we're living in the fifth wheel right now. We've been around the U.S. 2 times. It's been a struggle. It's almost like we've been wrestling with ourselves and with God.
Pretty awesome because you guys actually showed up. I watched you 15, 20 minutes sitting out here in that parking lot. And whenever you come in, the tears that you have and just everything, you guys are where you're supposed to be. And you know you're where you're supposed to be.
But as far as we know, what the Exodus is God brought His people out of bondage to Egypt. We've been in bondage to the world.
Yeah.
And He brought them out, and there was 42 lessons they had to learn. And they griped and complained and failed most of the way, but they get to the end, and He's still willing for them to cross the Jordan and take their land. And they when He said, go take the land, well, that's where they made their first mistake. They decided to send in spies. Well, wait a minute. It wasn't necessarily that the spies came back with a bad report. I know that's what it was, but think about it. If we don't say, no, we want to wait and send in spies, if we just do what He tells us to do, then we're not going to mess up with the spies coming back wrong.
Right? That's right.
So He's taken us out of the world and into His kingdom.
Hallelujah.
Excellent. Okay, so
I just have a quick comment.
yeah, but you're not a 6-monther.
No, but I just wanted to appreciate Julia and Robert because they've been here for 4 minutes or however long, a few days, and they have been to my house twice working on fences in the hot sun and helping me wrangle cows that are loose, and we've had some awesome fellowship and shared a meal or two. And anyway, they're just awesome mishpachah, so we already love them.
That's very cool. Okay, so Brittany, is there anything you want to add to Greater Exodus? They live in the Greater Exodus, is what you said. Okay, that's good. For those of us who are, fresh in, out of church or something like that, most of us learned that we were going to be raptured and that we were going to get the great escape ticket and everything was going to be okay while the poor Jews and, the sinners were here during the tribulation time. And what we have learned as part of the renewal of our mind to start thinking like Hebrews, or let's say like Yahweh does, like the Bible is written, is that things happen in cycles, right? And so that's one of the big things that we have to recognize again, is that if it happened in Scripture once, it happened twice and 3 and 4 times, and it's going to happen with us. Why? Because that's how we teach our children, by repetition. And that's how Abba teaches his children. So you'll get more details on Greater Exodus, in the future and as you listen to the radio and so on. Okay, so you've had all this time to think of a hard question. Uh-huh. or something that they had to pay attention to actually get? See, there's more to teaching here than just pushing forward through the speech, you know.
Hard question.
This is
Okay.
Becoming a mature teacher.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. You so much appreciate it. I guess what was something that kept them from gaining access to their inheritance?
Okay. Who's got it? Anybody. This is actually not that hard. Okay. I heard rebellion. I heard murmuring. You can all scout it out. What? Stubbornness. Good. Beer? Oh, fear. Sorry. Old ears. Oh, by the way, did Coach Ron get introduced yet?
No, we're going to.
Okay, good. All right. So, any more?